Welcome to another edition of our Subseasonal Forecast Contest. Today is May 12th, and we will be forecasting out, let me pull it up here on the screen. We're forecasting out to May 27th to May 31st. And again, we switched over to cooling degree days last week, and we're continuing to forecast cooling degree days. In terms of today's agenda, I think so we'll follow our normal format here with the attribution, then we'll get into the forecast. And again, we have kind of a light crowd today, so we could have a little bit of extra time to talk about research topics or just general any other ideas. One thing that I thought a little bit about before today's meeting is, we are obviously we're moving into summer eventually here. And I was thinking about the fact of, I know we do this every year, but seasonal predictors and just the validity of some of these seasonal predictions in general, and how much value they have versus just, or how much of the variance they explain versus just the looking at the climate trends, the climate change trends. And is there, I know for many years, of course, we've tried to make forecasts based on different seasonal predictors such as SSTs and stuff, but I think there's an open question there that maybe we can spend some time on if we have a few minutes. Any other agenda items that folks want to talk about today? Anything come to mind?
Nope, sounds good to what you listed off already.
Okay, great. All right, so again, just jump in here. Again, I think this will be a little bit more informal, but let's start with attribution. And we were talking just a minute ago, the attribution is quite interesting this week. It's been an interesting month, obviously, but it really got kind of capped off here in the last few days with the cold and even wintry weather. So our verification for this period of May 6th to May 10th was 57.2 HDDs. We're still, the verification periods here are still in HDDs. And as Zach and I were just talking about, this was, I can pull it up, this was the second coldest HDD for this 5-day period going back to 1950. So the only 5-day period, May 6th, May 10th, that was colder, you had to go back to 1954. And it was just barely less than a half HDD colder. So this was the real deal. And if you want to see the map, let me pull up the map again. I forget which one it is. Model. Yeah, there we go. Quite impressive here. I mean, what can you say about these anomalies? From Minneapolis to New York down to Atlanta, we had basically an area of minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and a lot of these areas were 10 to 15 degrees, and even some areas that were colder than 15 degrees for a 5-day period. So really impressive map there. Sorry, I think someone's trying to get in. Yep, Philip. Okay. All right. I guess looking at the attribution, and I guess this is one of the points worth talking about, is not exactly well projected or predicted by the guidance, the model guidance, CFS and the EC. So the CFS and the EC, around 32 and 36 HDs respectively. Normal was 32. So basically the EC was, predicting normal almost exactly. We verified, a few standard deviations, right? At least over two from normal. So this was a highly anomalous, and this is a classic. I think this is worth pointing out, putting aside the exact CRPS scores, I think we can all agree looking at this, that this event was not well captured by the guidance. Obviously some humans did a little bit better. But overall, this is my subjective opinion, but I feel like this is one of those where you say the detection rate, the models missed it. This highly anomalous event, one of the biggest cold events for this period, second on record, second coldest on record, was not well detected obviously by the EC, which was predicting normal, and even the CFS, which is historically a cold model, was, yeah, it was 4 HDDs above, but it wasn't. So I guess, that's a question here in terms of why weren't we able to better resolve it? And I guess that also, in fairness, it was just last week where we were talking about where we had an isle of warmth in a sea of cold. Remember last week, and I'll go back real quick. We verified on the warm side, right? What was the number? 26.5. It was warmer than any forecast. So we had a brief period of warmth. So I guess the added difficulty here, not to even make this more complicated than it already is, but we had one of the coldest events on record that, in my opinion, was not well detected by the model guidance, and it doesn't look like the human forecast did significantly better than that. And that followed last week, where we had a relatively warm period embedded in there, which makes it in some cases even harder. It's like you're coming off that warm week and stuff, or and of course then you have to try to determine if that warm period is a sign of a significant pattern change, or, and this turned out to be the case, or if it was just a synoptic event in a relatively long-lasting cold pattern, which again was the correct answer. So I've been talking for a while about this. I know these aren't easy questions, but just in general, does anyone have any other? It could even just be thoughts, just comments on this period, or thoughts in terms of why the numerical guidance anyway didn't do a better job at capturing this period. And while I'm opening that question for folks, I'll also pull up the radiant forecast from this period, just so we can take a look at that.
This period was interesting for many reasons for me, but I think it was within the last month we had that other verification. It might have been in the beginning of May, where we all predicted somewhere in like the 40s, and the verification came in at like 87. If you could, maybe I can pull it up and I can find what date that was, but I was curious if this was similar to that event.
Say that again. Can you say the numbers again, Zach? Sorry.
The verification came in at like 87.
Oh, okay, let me go back further.
It was within the last month. Yeah, here it is.
There we go. Yeah.
Was this the same where like well, actually no, it looks like the CFS that week was a lot closer than anybody else.
But a complete miss by the EC, right?
Yeah.
The EC is supposed to be the gold standard. That's two forecasts now within the past month where it was basically forecasting normal, and we had an extreme event.
Yeah. I'm curious because I know Michael likes to talk about teleconnections a lot in his forecast. I know the AO is kind of weakened since its long-standing positive streak. I'm curious if that had anything to do with these cold events starting to slip in, because these two events were quite different than anything we've had for the entire winter. So,
understanding that this is a bit of an odd year, at least in my memory, although ECMWF is the gold standard, this is not its stellar time of year. Just from thinking back to model diagnostics research that I've done, around April is when things kind of change, and oftentimes the GFS takes over in terms of performance from the ECMWF.
Interesting. And we talked also a little bit, I think it was Jason Lynn who was on our call last week, right? And I think we posed the question about what changed, because and this, Zach, you were getting to your thought there to Michael about what's, and I guess we can pull this up a little bit, but what changed over the past month and a half, I guess, going back to mid-April, after having such a relatively warm end of winter, why all this extreme cold now,
Yeah.
And
it's
the model's missing it. Yeah.
you can pull up the map from that April verification. We obviously just saw those look like those winter verification maps that we saw, early in like November, where we had that really cold period in November, and it seemed like we were bearing down for a cold winter, and then we just kept seeing warm verification after warm verification. So it's just interesting that it's all happening in April and May and not the earlier months like you expected to.
Yep. And it wasn't, I mean, let's look at this, since you brought it up. Let's look at the AO and NAO, Michael's favorite teleconnections, right? Or, but I mean, the AO, we did, that's right. We did have, I thought this was an interesting conversation last week. Jason, I think, alluded to this a little bit, but we did talk about that. Although the AO, remember, right? This period of much colder weather really started, at least verified across the United States, somewhere around mid-April, April 10th, I think, actually, maybe. So, around April 10th, we really started to get into this highly anomalous cold pattern with brief periods of synoptic warm-ups. But, especially up until the last few days, the AO wasn't negative, right? It just was a lot less positive. And that, we talked about that. Maybe that's a key, maybe. Oh, it's one of those things that if we all had a few extra hours, it'd be interesting to look at. The NAO, I guess the NAO had a big dip here. There could be something linked to that. I don't know. And then, of course, what was the EPO we talked about a lot last week too. And the EPO, when it's negative, it's cold, right? I think when it's negative, you have that suggests blocking or ridging, highly anomalous ridging anyway, across Alaska, to be more precise. And it looks like that started to change in late March. Let's look at the map just to make sure that looks right. According to this, around March 20th, there should be a ridge in Alaska if I'm interpreting this right. So let's check that out. And I bring this up because the cold may have been, again, the cold changes in the United States actually realized in around April 10th, I believe. But of course, the setup for that could have started, certainly occurred before that, right? The changes that precipitated that kind of cold, probably 1, 2, maybe 3 weeks even earlier, there were some signs of the configuration changing around to allow for that. So I guess this is it, this Gulf of Alaska change. Let's see. So that should have been a lot different than early March, right? Let's go to early March now. There should be troughing out in this area. It's not that, God, it's not that much different, is it? It's subtle. I guess it just shifts a little bit east. That's pretty big right there. I'm just moving it forward now. There's the cold. Boom. There's where it hit, right? Or yeah, mid-April.
I guess this is a question for you, Dave, if you have any experience with this, but like from a market perspective, like what are some of these forecasters to do in a situation like this where they're, they all forecast based on models, teleconnections, anything like that, and everybody's off by, 20, 30 HDDs. Like what are they supposed to do in that scenario? Like I'm sure traders would be pissed about that kind of thing, but how is anyone really supposed to know?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. My experience, there's a few different responses, and they probably reflect of human nature and in other kinds of work environments too. But there's different responses from meteorologists and from the traders. It depends, and different personality types. Sorry, someone's trying to get in. Looks like Dr. Lupo. But in my experience, So depending on the trader, again, I think some traders will be like, they just understand, especially if you've done this long enough, you're not going to get every forecast right. And, there's going to be misses. I think I think the ones who are, in my opinion, this is my opinion, obviously, most fair, they understand that you're not going to get it right, and they just want you to explain. And they want, they just want to be able to, and whether you get it right or wrong, I think as long as you can explain the rationale and as best you can explain what happened, I think that's what they expect. There's of course going to be certain folks who are going to be irrational about it and be like, how the heck did you miss this so badly? What are you crazy? What do they don't. That's not, I think, fair. Again, this is all my opinion. I keep saying it, but to the limits of the science and stuff like that. But you're going to get that kind of stuff occasionally, like and then from the meteorologist and stuff making the forecast, I think you also get a range of, you get the range of, hey, and this is a pet peeve of mine. Hey, everyone got it wrong, so it's not my fault. It almost sounds like an excuse, and I think the better way to put that is, this forecast was very challenging. We did not detect it well because of X, Y, and Z, and we believe we believe that the other evidence that suggests this was sort of beyond the limits of the science is because we also looked at other forecasts, and other forecasters also did not resolve this well. I think that's a better way to put it. But I think a lot of people, I've heard this a million times where folks say, oh, everyone missed it, it's not my fault, kind of thing. And then I think there's the attribution part, which I think also ranges from, I think it's very hard in the industry to say, I don't know. Not that you should just say, I don't know, but that in a number of cases, I think that is ultimately the short version of the right answer. Being able to say, hey, listen, we're going to look at this, we're going to study this, we're going to do this. But based on everything we know about numerical guidance and our analog tools and things like that, we don't know why it missed, and this is what we're going to do to try to better understand the future, but we don't know. That's a hard thing to say. So a lot of times what you end up doing is you Monday morning quarterback it a lot, and you say things like, oh, now, it was the MGO and the, this, that, you find foils. You find like, yeah, the strat actually had a much bigger impact than I expected and blah, blah, blah. And the reason I say that with a little bit of a tone is because I think in a lot of cases, it's a very subjective analysis. It's not a deep dive research investigation in terms of really making sure that that's the rationale. It's just a way to sound smart or sound like you really understand it, and so that you can move on to the next topic. And I think that's equally wrong because it sends the wrong message about that you actually really understand what happened. And I think in most cases, unfortunately, it's kind of like how we feel a lot of cases where it's unfulfilling, but that's meteorology. That's subseasonal forecasting. Sometimes it's unfulfilling in the sense that, even when you have extreme events like this, where you have, 57 or whatever it was, 57 HDDs, and none of the forecasts were within 20, that you still don't have a great answer as to how you can do a lot, make a better forecast in the future.
Hey, Dave, can I add to
Sure,
that?
please.
I think one of the other just issues with this general topic is that by the time, there's no time to sit and do that in-depth analysis of why it went wrong, and we never seem to go back and do it. And it would be great to use some of this time over the summer to maybe do a real in-depth analysis of the winter. Once the climate diagnostics bulletin is out and we have, absolutely everything that we can possibly look at, and we can look at things that we didn't look at, while we were forecasting, and then improve ourselves, possibly for next year.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. One other thing that comes to mind, I always, there was, just pulling up the surface temperatures, where the surface temperatures. We know, down here. This map has obviously changed as, of course, this is looking at the last week. We've discharged a lot of cold into Eastern North America. But, in advance of this event, there was the the sort of there was a pretty significant cold pool in Western Canada, and I think it would be interesting to look at that. And I feel like there could be better analysis on this, better research to look at the relationship between, setting the stage, so to speak, having that cold pool in Western Canada, and the relationship there between model error, but also just in terms of those big pattern shifts like what we saw. Are they a requirement? Just to be able to put some numbers around these things. I don't have the answers. It's just experiential, but I think it would be, say, when you get pattern shifts like we did, where you go into a 1 month plus cold pattern, what percentage of the time do you have those cold pools already available in Western Canada versus not? And how well do the models forecast those changes when you have it? And I guess you can tell the reason I bring up this sort of concept or research idea is because I think there probably are some interesting findings there. And I've heard folks talk about it for a long time, and I'm sure there's some research on it, but I think there should be, it could be an interesting area to look at.
Hey, Dave, something else I wanted to toss
Yeah.
in since we're talking a little bit about attribution. I was going over my forecast from this period, and I read that the forecast for the EPO was neutral, which obviously was not the case. It was actually quite strongly negative, resulting in a lot of blocking. So combined with a negative AO and NAO, I believe that's considered to be like the holy grail of
Right.
cold signals for the East. So I don't know if that was the only thing, but I'd say that definitely had something to do with it.
The fact
when
that so you're saying effectively that the EPO forecast missed?
Yeah, and pretty badly, I think, because if I'm reading this correctly, the bottom one I think would have been the forecast for that time frame where it looks to be essentially, that to me is a non-signal. It's just neutral, doesn't mean anything, but it actually wound up being that's a significant signal, obviously. So that's pretty strongly negative.
I mean, I think that's a great point. I tend to think you're right. I think if there's one, I think that's there's a secondary question, which is the why. Like, why did it miss? But in terms of saying, would an EPO miss of this magnitude with already, and I'll throw in with already such a strong cold pull in Western Canada, could it result in a massive error for the eastern half of the United States? My experience is heck yeah. Because there's, I think, we've looked at this in the past, I think there's no other more important teleconnection than like a 10-day, looking out about 10 days, 6 to 10 days for the Eastern United States and the EPO. It's even, I think it explains even more temperature, especially at certain times of the year, than some temperature variance than the NAO. So the fact that it became the Gulf of Alaska ridge was much stronger, and you had a cold pool which then was able to be presumably dislodged, sent much further south and eastward, surged much further south and eastwards because there was more upstream ridging or blocking. Yeah, but then the second question is why? Why was the EPO so? I'm glad you brought this up. I'm so glad. I think it's an awesome point.
Now, just make sure I understand this correctly. This is showing the forecast leading up to the analysis, which is the verification. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. So to read this, I'll try to point as we're going down. So the 14-day forecast, and I'm kind of like kind of blah neutral. And then all of a sudden, around 7 days out.
Well, that's not. That's not shocking.
Yeah. Maybe not shocking, but like again, like how if you could have known that the 14-day, as that the models would have shifted from this kind of look 14 days out to this kind of look 7 days out, right? You probably would have made a much different forecast, right? The numerical guidance obviously would have been a lot colder, and question is why'd they miss it, right?
Well,
is it something that's
is
there a real signal, or is it just noise? What do you think, Lynn?
Well, I mean, just looking at this one plot, that would at least leave open the possibility of, it's just the model is missing some key part of the physics there, right? So the way to investigate this is to look at just data to see if you can physically understand 2 weeks ahead of time looking at that, or identifying something that the model is missing.
Yeah.
I think only looking at the model is, can mislead your conclusions.
Yeah. And I know we can switch here to the forecast. I know we can't avoid, it's always, it's more fun, right, to talk about the past than sometimes it is to try to figure out what's going to happen in the future. But I was just going to, this was the forecast, right? This was the radiant or Maxar forecast from April 1st, verifying for that period. So they definitely had some cold up across the north. The models, well, the CFS had a better looking for pattern anyway, pattern configuration. And just to show again how it verified, where was it? We're talking May 6th, right? May 6th, May 10th. Let's take a look, and I'll zoom in across the United States. Well, that's the global, but I'll zoom in here. Yeah, and so seeing this makes me think of the comment from that we talk about a lot that I originally heard from Professor Torn. The gradient problem, that the models were projecting a pretty strong gradient across the United States. And what happens if that shifts a little bit north or south? Well, in this case, it was a little bit more than a little, but it certainly shifted south and resulted in a lot more cold weather. But yeah, I don't know. Any other thoughts from anyone in terms of this recent cold period?
I guess for me, it also highlights the fact that during this time of the year, or I should say during that time of the year, the Northeast and the Midwest play a very oversized influence on HCDs just because that's the only area that has HCDs in the first place. And sometimes just looking at a map anomaly, like if you go back one period, I think the previous period was more obvious, where you could see that still a good part of the US was above average, but you've got all those cold anomalies sitting in the Midwest and Northeast to generate the high HCDs regardless of what's going on in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Very good point.
Yeah, that is a great point, right? Because we know in April in particular, most of your HDDs, come from the north, and that was the bread and butter here.
And I like that point because it's important to separate when we're going back and analyzing that we should maybe first be looking, not at the HDDs and looking at the actual output from the model itself, and then separating that from, how the maps are skewed when we compute HDDs because of the weighting.
Yeah. Here's the map in HDD anomalies. So yeah, it's basically on the Chicago New York corridor there. Okay. I guess we can move on to the forecast, right? So, and yeah, this is a good segue because maybe there's some signs looking at some of these numbers here that things are going to change, right? All right. So just as a reference point, again, it's May 12th. We're forecasting out toward the very end of May. We're in CDDs now. And the 30-year normal is, where's the 30-year normal? It's 25 and a half. 10 years, it's interesting. It's starting to be a pretty big gap between, I think we see this in the summer between, because of the trend. But anyway, the 10-year CDDs is 30, so kind of a decent gap there. And we have some forecasts, the majority of forecasts certainly, that are warmer, hotter than the 30-year. So it seems like everyone here is, or most folks, I should say anyway, not everyone, Dr. Lupo, will be interesting to hear from you, is forecasting a change to something warmer than what we've seen. And it looks like we have a range here of 35 on the warm end to 18 from the CFS on the cool end. Again, these are in CDDs. So if you're lower in CDDs, if you're lower than the 30-year, then that means you're effectively cooler. And if you're higher, then that means you're effectively warmer. So who wants to get us started and talk about their forecast rationale?
I can go first.
Sure. Michael.
All right. Is this the 2-minute spiel, or is this or is this more informal?
I
So I
think
can
it's Michael.
run on a-
That's a great question. I think it's always great. I think to start with the 2-minute spiel, because that's most realistic in terms of like you're doing it, and then so I would say go through your 2-minute spiel. Like your end client, you pretend it's me or anyone on the line. You got 2 minutes to get them the information that they need to know, and then after that, we'll talk about some follow-up questions.
All right. Okay, so my forecast was for 31.1 CDDs, with a spread of 9.2. That's about average for spread. Big change this week that I saw. Actually, I guess there were a few. The EPO appears to be switching to strongly positive. Looks to be switching over from that negative regime that gave us that almost record cold. NAO, AO, and I believe the PNA all look to be around neutral, so no strong signal. Didn't see a strong signal there. And the CPC has a lot of warmth, especially in the higher demand areas like the South. So Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, they all look to be above average. So definitely a warm signal from the CPC. So all that came together and got me to 31.1. As for a risk to the forecast, I would say I definitely think it could be warmer than my forecast. I wouldn't say much warmer, just because we'd be getting a little too close to record territory for my taste, at least outside of my spread in terms of normal. So big risk for my forecast in particular is if the EPO decides to do the opposite of what it's forecast, which there is precedence for, looking at that that chart of the reanalysis. That would be the only risk that I see to this forecast, would be the EPO not materializing as strongly positive as it's forecasted to do so. Any questions, comments, complaints, concerns?
Yeah, Michael, I guess, thank you for your forecast. Michael, when we talked to you earlier, let's pretend we're still we're doing the role play here. You talked about EPO. Well, you told me earlier that the EPO was, if I can pull it up, sorry, that the EPO was failed, or I'm sorry, it came in much more negative than was projected, and that was in part what might explain this cold period. So how come you trust it now when you're talking about this 14-day forecast, which has failed recently, and now you're suggesting that that's a data point that gives you confidence that we're going to go into a warm pattern?
Yeah, I mean, I understand your concern there. It's mainly the one big difference between that particular forecast and this forecast, in my opinion anyway, is there was no strong signal at that point. You can see the forecast there was essentially zero. There was no signal whatsoever. It's neutral. This week, for this particular forecast, there is a strong signal, and it's hard for me to ignore a strong signal like that, even though there are instances, and if we could spend the next 10 minutes nitpicking through this data and find all the instances where the EPO has been wrong at this lead time, even with a strong signal. Um, but I think that it would be, I guess, irresponsible of me to ignore a EPO that looks to be that strong, and especially not without any kind of data to tell me that, oh, you should pick the other side. Since just kind of looking at this, there are instances where it says negative and it goes positive, but there are instances where it says negative and it goes negative, or positive and it goes positive. It's not as clear to me for correction purposes like it was with the AO, where I could say, oh well, it's consistently over the past 3 weeks been verifying at the upper end of guidance. I don't have that kind of a clear signal here, so in lieu of that, and then if there's any data to prove me wrong, I'll change my forecast. But in lieu of any kind of data to show them that to me, I have to stick with what the model says, since it is a stronger signal than I've seen in the past month or so.
So Michael, you're telling me that this bar here, that's what you consider to be a strong signal?
Well, it looks on this chart, it doesn't look as impressive, but if you go to the there's a different page on the actual. I'll just post the link so it's easier to find. On this particular page, it looks much stronger than it does on that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so your justification is that the signal is stronger and so more likely reliable than when it was. Okay. Um, um, uh, I think I would just, this is my 2 cents. Another way you could have addressed that question, I think, is to say, it's not just the 14-day. If it were the 14, like some change, like let's say the forecast were super cold for the next 10 days, and then day 14 looked warm. This is just my opinion, but that to me would be, uh, I'd have more trepidation. I'd have more concern about the pattern really changing. But we know, and I'm looking at the WD or HDDs. It doesn't matter. We could look at CDDs too. But what this is telling me, in looking at these short-term forecasts, this is May 12th, May 13th, May 14th, you can see by the color code here, the models are suggesting a change here by day 3, a normalization by day 3. And by day 4, they're actually suggesting warmer than normal by day 4. So this is, and that's corroborated, of course, by what you can see in the maps. If you just, let's say, the EC Ensemble 500 Mobile Heights. If I look at, hour 12, I still see that big blue across, barreling into Zach's neighborhood there in Mass. But as I go out to 72 hours, boom, all of a sudden, I'll zoom in on this so you can see it, United States. You see, look at that, a ridge, finally. And then, okay, but then you say to yourself, well, but maybe it's, I'm going to zoom back out again, maybe it's a short-term blip, like, we saw in that other forecast. Well, now as I go through more hours, I'll just go through this quickly, I'm seeing more and more, I'm not seeing that, right? I'm seeing actually some consistency in more ridging than troughing over the eastern half of the United States. And I think, I'm just doing a quick preview here, but I see that. So I think another way you could answer that question is to say, hey, Joe Schmo, it's not just because I see a change at day 14. It's because I see a pattern shift beginning on day 2 and 3, and I see the models largely consistent with maintaining a shift away from cold, not from into day 6, day 10, day 14. And it's in part because of that data that I'm also more confident that, you know, this is not just going to be what we saw last time, which was a quick blip and a return to cold, that this is something different than what we saw in the past. Just a thought. That's, you know, just another.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you're saying.
Cool. Okay, any other questions for Michael before we shift to someone else? All right. Thank you, Michael. Who would like to go next?
I can go next.
All right, thanks, Philip.
All right. So
And
you
Philip,
can
yeah, if you can, because I can't remember if you were on when we started doing this, but like try to do like this 2-minute drill. You know, pretend you got you're with a client, right? So you're the consultant, you're with a client, and they're kind of saying, "Hey, Philip, I don't have a lot of time. Just give me in 2 minutes, give me the most important information I need to know about this forecast."
Okay.
All right.
All right. So you can see my forecast here. We have CDDs of 30.4 with a spread of 6.9, so a smaller spread. And one of the largest weights is our 10-year mean, which looks very warm. And I also noted that the temperatures look warmer the shorter the time frame you look at in terms of the past. And the CPC, as was already mentioned, is showing a lot of warmth in most of the US with only some slight cold in the northernmost tier. And from the tropical signal and the teleconnection seem to be a pretty weak signal this time, which is one of the factors of uncertainty. But it looks like we have some slight warmth from the MJO signal and also possibly some slight warmth from the teleconnections with the AO, NAO going negative. Going neutral to possibly slightly positive. The EC is showing near normal, but slightly below average, which I thought was rather weird because the EC shows anomalous ridging over most of North America on their 500 millibar departures. And putting everything together, I got to my value of 30.4, and I included a 1 CDD fudge factor due to possibly warmer concerns, especially with the pattern shift that's expected. Any questions?
Yeah, Philip. So you're forecasting something that's pretty close to the 10-year. Certainly warmer than the 30-year. What's your confidence that this isn't just another head fake that we saw? You know, last week's verification, it got warm, and then this week we got blasted again with cold. The cold, the verification. What's the chances here that the models are going to do this again, and we're going to end up just going right back into another cool pattern here? What do you? What's? Can you just tell me? Describe your confidence best you can, and tell me, and then just elaborate a little bit more as to why this is different.
I think there are two areas that give me higher confidence. One is the pattern change that has been alluded to that looks fairly consistent on all of the models, and it looks fairly consistent even on the short range. So I think we have pretty high confidence that after May 15 or so that we're going to be shifting into a warmer pattern as opposed to the current cool pattern. The other thing that gives me confidence is that thing I alluded to where the 20-year moving average is progressively warmer than the 30-year and so forth, all the way down to the 10-year moving average being extremely warm compared to the 10-year, compared to the 30-year normal. And then the spread for the different moving averages is also smaller than the spread for the 30-year normal. So including a climate shift, it seems like a higher CDDs makes more sense.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other questions for Philip? All right. We have time for a couple more, I think.
I'll go next, Dave.
Yeah, great.
So my forecast was for 31.4 CDDs with a normal spread of 9.2 CDDs. I didn't give my summary last week because I was on the call, but I'll kind of give my 2 cents this time around. Basically, this formula of 60% on weight on the 10-year and 40% on the trend was a formula I used a lot last summer. I had some decent success with it, so I'm returning to it and seeing, experimenting a little bit. Basically, I used that formula more so in the middle of the summer where there was more consistent warmth. I didn't really use it in May when we're kind of transitioning and having anomalous cool periods kind of thrown in there as well. But some of my mentality for this week, kind of similar to what's been alluded to before. I saw a lot of warmth in the 500 millibar height departure patterns for both the CFS and the EC, both leading up to the period and during the period itself, which gives me some confidence that this could be a warm verification. The CPC is also showing significant warmth in those regions that are starting to accumulate CDDs. So overall, my number is 5-6 CDDs, warmer than the 30-year, and the normal spread I feel it would encapsulate any sort of anomalous warmth that we could see, but I definitely think that there's a bit of a warm risk to this forecast. I don't think it'll be an anomalously warm risk, but it could be a couple of CDDs warmer than what I forecasted.
Huh. Okay. Any questions for Zach? I think it's interesting that you don't have any model guidance in your weightings.
Yeah, I haven't. It's been a long time since I've consistently put weight on the models. I think this forecasting in this game for the last year or so now has given me a little confidence to reliably forecast with the models. But who knows? Maybe they'll have a good week this week.
Considering the model forecasts, I think that's a good idea.
Okay. Let's see. Dr. Lupo, are you on the line there? Did you want to?
Yes,
Oh,
we're on the line, and we have just been listening to all of the discussion here. And I just noticed that our forecast is kind of way out there compared to everybody else's. And I'm going to confess that Joe and I and the team didn't spend a lot of time on it this week because we have we're preparing a proposal for a project, and it's finals week. But some of the thinking that we put into it is that we noticed some of the warming trends that all of you have been talking about here. And I think this is the second time we're doing the CDD forecast.
right.
And so we kind of argued the point back and forth. Well, it's only the end of May, and we're seeing a lot of warmth where conditions are normally fairly warm. And we wondered if that would mean that folks would not, we tried to figure in the economic impact that maybe many people wouldn't be using their AC just yet since it's only May. And then I kept thinking about the fact that we've seen an uptick in blocking lately. And so that kind of tempered us back toward we were tempering it back toward the 30-year. And then we ended up, I think Joe submitted the forecast this morning, and he went even a little cooler than the 30-year. But I was thinking right around that 30-year, hedging on the increased blocking activity. But we're kind of getting our feet wet with this CDD stuff and trying to flip our thinking from the WDD to the CDD. So this is going to be a little bit of a trial for us.
I think that's interesting. I'm actually a little bit surprised that more folks didn't go, on the cooler end based on what we've seen recently. And Dr. Lupo, I think you guys have done quite well recently. I think your forecast this past week was think it was near the top, right? Yeah, in terms of the human forecast, you guys had one of the best scores. And, you know, we didn't look at this earlier, but was it the 30 day? When you look at, you know, the bias, I'll just sort this, the bias over the last 30 days, certainly the bias has been that the models have underestimated, this is HDs, but what it tells you is that the models have underestimated the cold, right? That the
Right.
verification was much colder than expected for the last 5 weeks, an average of 10 and 15, depending on the forecast. But so, you know, there's some data points here, some evidence that says taking the cold side of things could be the way to go this time.
Yeah, that increase in the blocking activity kind of drove our tendency on that, and that the models have been underdoing the cooling, so, or cooler conditions they've been underdoing. So that's what certainly drove us 3 weeks ago for this particular period that just verified. You know, we saw this trend toward cooling, but you know, forecasting a 4 and 5 sigma height anomaly is just uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think who was it a few minutes ago said that too. So
Yeah. And especially when the models were so benign, right?
right.
You know, you have the EC, which was basically forecasting normal. I think it was almost exactly 32.4, and the verification or the normal was, I think, 32.4. Yeah. So it's not like the numerical guidance really gave a great hint of an extreme event. You know.
No, it didn't.
So this be an interesting verification for sure to see if we do finally come out of this highly anomalous cold pattern, or into something different, or if this is or if we're still going to see volatility and some coolish themes. So something to look forward to, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay, looks like, well, that was good. I mean, we're just about out of time. Anyone have any parting thoughts before we end our call?
Dave, if you could just show the heating season rankings overall, because I know we only have one verification left. We can kind of get a sense about what the race to the finish is going to look like.
That's right. So that's a good way to put it. Actually, I was looking at this earlier, and I think, it's so you can sort. You can look at different metrics. I started with directionally correct, right? So that's being on the right side, the correct side, I should say, of the 30-year normal. So if we go by that metric, the folks at the top are, that have more than one or two forecasts, are Dr. Roundy there and Dr. Lupo. Actually, you guys both have the same percentage, just different counts. And then industry is also done quite well. And then Zach, I think as far as our student forecaster, has done quite well. And I've also done a great job. No, I'm kidding. I'm the flip of a coin. So that's about what I'm worth, a quarter. I guess you could use the nickel. And then we have on the lower end of things, the CFS at 40%. So basically the CFS, if you had bet against the CFS, you would have been right 60% of the time. And then again, you can look at it, the CRPS versus normal, or the CRPS versus consensus. I like to look at it consensus, but so looking at that metric real quick. Let's see, I'm looking at here. There's Philip. Philip who's there near the top, or at the top. And then we've got Zach, who's also pretty high up. And some of us in the middle of the pack. And the reason why I think like someone like Paul Roundy is not doing as well with this metric is because Paul tends to he's not afraid to make some more anomalous type forecasts, more extreme forecasts. And, directionally, that's worked out well for him. He's more times than not, he's been on the right side of things. But there have been a few forecasts where they didn't pan him out, like where he was maybe forecasting pretty strong warmth in a verified cold. And so I think that's where some of those penalties come into, or that's why he's been penalized more with that. So, there's different metrics, but that's kind of how things are stacking up right now. Any other thoughts on this, Zach?
No, I just wanted to let everybody take a look at it.
Yeah. Then we have the bias too. You can sort by the bias. Not sure. It's. I think last summer. The last thing I'll say, like I do want to hopefully sometime soon, in the next couple of weeks, update. What are our new? These guys, the performance charts for the summer. I think it'd be really helpful to have these charts, but for the cooling season. So hopefully we can get that online here sooner than later. Because again, I just think there were a lot of really interesting takeaways when we looked at this from the heating season that could be helpful and applicable as we think about, trying to make the best summer forecast. So, okay, I know we're already over time, so thank you so much for, I think, great participation. It was a really interesting attribution period and kind of an interesting forecast here. Zach, let's see, we're going to see everyone again. Is it next Tuesday?
Next Tuesday, yep.
Next Tuesday. All right. Again, thank you, everyone. Have a good week.
Thanks, you
You
too.
too. See you, everybody.
Bye.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.